So we are jumping into something new today. We are starting a new series that we are just calling Uncommon Sense. You know what common sense is. Hopefully you would say, yeah, I got that. I've got common sense, you know. But what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks is we're going to be talking about uncommon sense. Sense that it doesn't just naturally come to us, but it's things that God gives us that point us in His direction and give us a new way in life. But before we just dive into that, I want to ask you to participate with me for a minute, all right? So I want you to actually speak out loud for a second. And I'm going to prompt you, and I promise this is not going to be a hard, tricky thing. You're going to know the answers to these, okay? But what we're going to do is I'm going to give you the first part of a common sense kind of phrase, and you're going to give me the second half of that, right? So in every culture, there are these phrases that maybe you call them proverbs, maybe you call them, you know, life statement, whatever you want to call it. But we have these statements that kind of set the foundation for how we think as a culture and the way that we interact with each other. And they are these wisdom kinds of statements. You know these. We have them in our culture. You know these, okay? So like I said, I'm going to give you the first half of the statement. You respond with the second half. And if the person sitting in front of you can't clearly hear your answer, you're not speaking loud enough, all right? So say this is not a trick question. You're going to know these things, all right? So here's the first one. Give them an inch,
and they'll take a mile.
They'll take a mile. I heard you. Very good, all right? So the second one. The grass is always greener
on the other side.
All right, so you know these, right? I mean, we debate, do I put the fence part in there or not, right? But we know the grass is greener over there somewhere, right? So these are just common sense statements. Here's one that's really short. Haste
makes waste.
Makes waste. A little slower on that one. All right, the early bird
gets the worm.
To each
his own.
Different strokes
for different folks.
All right, good deal. You got, I mean, I saw for the most part, you scored like a 90 there, okay? I'll give you an A on that test. You did pretty well. Here's the last one for you, all right? The fear of the Lord
is the beginning of wisdom.
All right, yeah. You actually were on it and said it. If you're like, I've heard this, I think, I know this is something that I'm supposed to know, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, or the beginning of knowledge. And that is a statement that's going to be a key statement for us as we're moving forward. This series that we're starting, called Uncommon Sense, is a series where we're just walking through the book of Proverbs together. And the way that we do this at Trailhead is we ask you to read one chapter a day of a book, so 7 chapters in a week. And then on the weekend we come together and we talk about something from those 7 chapters that we've been reading, right? And so right now we are reading the book of Proverbs, and you may be saying, I didn't get the memo, I didn't hear, nobody told me we were reading Proverbs. Good news is, you are not too far behind. We're only 7 chapters in. You can read that in like 15 minutes this afternoon, right? So read the 7 chapters and then 1 chapter a day. So this coming week, we'll read chapters 8 through 14, and we'll start to discuss that next week, all right? Does anybody know or remember who the author or compiler is of the book of Proverbs?
Solomon.
All right. You know, I was about to say, I know somebody knows it, you just don't want to say it. So somebody finally said, Solomon is the author of Proverbs. Solomon is the son of King David, right? He was the king of Israel for a while. And the way that he compiled this book, the way that it all got started was actually with a dream. I don't know if you remember this part, but it tells us in the book of Kings, we're not going to turn there and look, but I'll just tell you the story. It tells us in Kings that Solomon had a dream, and as he was dreaming in the middle of the night, God comes to him in this dream and says to him, Solomon, ask me for whatever you want. That's a dream that I personally would like to have. You know, I hadn't had it yet where God's just said, anything you want, you ask of me, right? Maybe that's a dream you would like to have, but that's a dream Solomon literally had, and And God says, Solomon, just tell me what it is that you want, and I will give it to you. And Solomon says this. He says, because I am a new king. He was following his father, right? And he had just been king for a while. He says, because I'm a new king, I don't know how to lead this nation. I don't know how to lead these people. So his request was, he said, if I could ask for anything of you, God, I ask that you would give me wisdom so that I would know how to lead these people, so that I would know how to direct this nation in line with what you are doing. And God looks at him and says, Solomon, because you've asked for wisdom, I'm going to pour out wisdom on you. But because you didn't ask for revenge against your enemies, because you didn't ask for riches and fame, he says, I'm going to give that to you anyway. I'm going to give you wisdom so you're going to be the smartest man in the world. And I am also going to give you riches and honor. And he did. God poured out wisdom on him to the point where all the other kings of the nations around him start coming, flocking to Israel because they want to hear what Solomon had to say. They wanted to pick his brain. They wanted to see some of his wisdom. And this is a little bit before Facebook, so Solomon couldn't just shoot his great wisdom to the world or tweet it out to anybody, right? So they came to him. Queens got on boats and came so that they could listen to the wisdom of Solomon. And it was in that context where Solomon started writing down and compiling these wise sayings, these proverbs that we have in this book. And it's not all him. He would take some wise sayings from other kings and other leaders, and he would put those in this book of Proverbs as well. And one of the things that he consistently says, as you read this book, you're going to see it over and over. And if you've read the first 7 chapters, you've already seen it at least twice. One of the things that he says over and over is he says, the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. In fact, he says it 7 verses into the book. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. He presents us with this idea. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. So I don't know how that hits you, but if you look at that, really what Solomon is saying is he's saying, if you want to be wise, if you want to really live lives of wisdom, you're going to have to pay attention to the voice of God. The fear of God is where it all starts. Pay attention to God. That's where wisdom happens. That's where wisdom shows up, right? And so that's what we're going to see throughout this book is that Solomon is telling us, if you want to know wisdom, you really ought to pay attention to the voice of the one who created heaven and earth, the one who knit you together cell by cell. He knows a little more than the people standing around you. He knows a little more than you do. The one who's outside of time and space so that he knows what's coming down the road. He knows what's happening in the future. He knows what happened in the past. He knows. And if you want wisdom, you need to pay attention to his voice. I don't know about you, but for me, one of the things that immediately comes to mind when I hear that is, well, how do I know when I'm listening to God's voice versus just my voice and a good idea that I'm having, or just a thought or a rationalization? How do I know this is God and not me? How do I know that this is not just coincidence? This is not just a crazy circumstance? How do I know that this is God and not just the world happening the way the world happens? Right? And so over the next few weeks, what we're doing as we walk through the book of Proverbs is we are talking about this idea. We're answering this question, how can I recognize God's voice as opposed to just my thoughts and my rationalizations? And I think Solomon helps us to answer that in a number of ways. One of the passages that helps us answer that is one that you may be familiar with. If you grew up in the church, what we are looking at today is a few verses that you may have memorized as a kid. You may know these verses by heart, but I think they have a lot to tell us. We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 3 this morning, and we're just going to walk through the first several verses of Proverbs chapter 3, where Solomon helps us start to distinguish, how do I know God's voice versus just my voice, the way that I would do things versus the way God does them, right? So let's just read it together. Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 1, he says this. It says, my son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity. So right from the beginning of this chapter, you see who he's talking to, right? He's writing this section to his son. We don't know how old his son is. Maybe he's a teenager. Maybe he's a young adult. But he's saying, I'm going to tell you some things that are going to make your life better, right? The way that he says it is literally, don't forget my commands. Listen to what I am telling you, and this will prolong your life. If you're a parent, you have probably made a very similar statement at some point in time. Maybe you just made it in the opposite way. Solomon says it in a very gentle, kind way where he says, listen to what I'm telling you, my child, and it will prolong your life. Maybe you said it something like this. If you want to live past this moment, you better start listening to what I'm telling you, right? That's kind of the way we tend to go. Solomon is nice about it, but he's just saying, I'm trying to help you here. I'm trying to give you insight. I'm trying to give you wisdom. I'm trying to help you understand, my son, how to live the kind of life that you really want to live, whether you understand this right now or not. He goes on in verse 3, and he starts to give him some of the sense of wisdom, some of the direction that his son should go. So he says this, let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. And so he pulls out, as he starts to give direction to his son, he pulls out these two virtues. He says, let love and faithfulness go with you wherever you go. Bind them around your neck. Where do you go where your neck doesn't go? Hopefully nowhere, right? That would be really weird. And so he's saying everywhere you go and everything that you're doing, be driven by love and faithfulness. And if you do those things, if you let these virtues drive you, you know what? You're getting close to the wisdom and heart of God. You're stepping in, you're stepping toward the wisdom and the heart of God. So he says, let these two things drive you, almost like core values. I don't know if you have core values for your life. Some people write out values, but these are the things that drive us. We have core values here at our church. You know, we have the core value of lifestyle hospitality. We have the core value of servant generosity. I know you guys could go on and list our other core values, right? But we have core values that drive us as a church. And Solomon is pulling these things out and he's saying, let these things, let love and faithfulness be the values that drive you in everything that you're doing in life. After he says that, he gets to some verses that, these are the verses we're about to read, where if you have been around the church, you may have memorized these verses. You're going to recognize these. If you have not been around the church, you will probably recognize these verses. These are verses that are probably going to sound familiar to you, whether you've grown up in this context or not. And what he's doing is he's saying, okay, I've given you these two values in order to follow God. And now he's about to say, and here's how you start to recognize when God is speaking to you versus just a good idea that you are having. As you live your life based on these values and you pay attention to God, here's how you recognize the difference between God's voice and your voice. So even though you may have heard these verses 10,000 times, don't let it go in one ear and out the other, because it's incredibly important what he's about to tell us. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 says this, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Some of you, like I said, could quote that with me, right? You know these verses. I could have given you the first half of the verse and you could have given me the second half of the verse, right? You know this. You've heard it before. But I think it's incredibly important to just pause for a second and slow down and say, let's dig into this because this matters, all right? This is important stuff. What does it mean to lean on my own understanding? If I'm leaning on my own understanding, if you're leaning on your own understanding, what we typically say in those moments is, well, I've always done this, or I believe I should do this, or I think this is the way it should go, right? Those are the moments where we have kind of our default answer. I've been in this situation before, and I have always done it this way in the past, and so this is what I should do again going forward, right? That's what it means to lean on your own understanding and say, I know this. I've been in this scenario. I've been in this situation. Here's what I do in this scenario. What Solomon says is he says, don't lean on yourself there. Don't lean on your past. Don't lean on your default answer. Don't lean on what you think you know at the moment. Trust God instead. And the way he says it, I love the wordplay that he uses here. He uses the word, don't lean on your own understanding. Think about that for just a second. What scenarios occur in your life where you lean on something? Chances are you lean on something just like I'm leaning on this chair right now if you are relaxed, if you're comfortable, right? If you're talking to a friend and you're leaning up against the wall, that's because you're just doing life. You're taking it easy. You're not worried about the conversation. You're not fretting over what's being said. You're in a situation where you're like, I know this person. I know this conversation. I can relax. I can take it easy, right? I really think what Solomon is saying to us on one end is he's saying when you're in moments in life that are comfortable, you know these scenarios. You've always walked through them. In those comfortable moments where you can just feel like I can take it easy here. Solomon says be really, really careful not to lean on your own wisdom in those moments of comfort. Be really careful that when you feel like, oh, everything is going the way that it's supposed to, life is good, life is the way I want it to be really careful that in that moment you don't say, I am going to just lean on what I've always done. I'm going to go to my default. This is what I always do in this scenario. So in moments of comfort, be careful, Solomon says. But what's the other time that you lean on something? Another scenario where you lean on something is if you're injured, if you're hurt, right? If I had a broken leg, I would be standing up here with crutches and I would be leaning on the crutches to support my weight. And the idea is when you're hurting, you lean on something to support you. Again, in moments where you're hurting in life. When you're in that heat of the moment argument with your spouse or the person that you love, it's really easy to lean on, well, this is my answer in this scenario. This is what you should listen to, I'm trying to tell you. It's really easy to lean on my own understanding. In the moments where you're looking up and saying, I don't know how we're going to pay the bills this month. It's really easy to lean on, well, this is what I've done in the past in order to get through this. You know, in those moments where something's going on and life is hard and it feels like a struggle, we tend to have our default. And Solomon again comes to us and he says, in those hard moments, don't lean on what you've done in the past. Don't just default to what you always do. Don't lean on your own understanding. Instead, trust God. And so I think if we were to kind of bring all of this together into a statement for us, I think part of what he's saying here is he is saying, don't settle for the simple answer. Because the simple answer is my default, right? In this case where you're trying to figure out what to do, you're trying to figure out how to handle this, it says don't just settle for the simple answer. That's what you've always done. That's common sense, right? That's what you've always thought would work. That may be why you're in the scenario you're in now, right? So don't settle for the simple answer. But instead of saying, I always, or I think this is what I should do, I think what he's telling us is he's saying, what you do instead is you become a student of God. In the moment, in the heat of battle, you turn to God. Rather than saying, I'm going to default to my always answer, I'm going to turn to God and say, God, what do you do in this scenario? Maybe I open Scripture and look for a story that indicates how Jesus walked through a scenario like this. Maybe I just turn to God and say, God, I don't know what to do. Will you give me direction? Will you lead me? Will you show me? But what Solomon is pointing us to is he says, stop leaning on your wisdom. Start becoming a student of God in that situation. So you read and you pray and you ask and you knock and you say, God, I'm not going away until you show me how you would handle this scenario. I think that's what Solomon is pointing us toward. And you know what happens when you start to do that? Not only do you get wisdom from God, but the other thing that happens is all of a sudden you start to be able to distinguish between, oh, that's my way, that's my voice, and that is God's way, and that's God's voice. And you start to see there's separation here. All of a sudden you start to understand the difference between what God says in a scenario versus what you default to in a scenario. You start to recognize his voice because of the way that you're processing it. And that's what Solomon is telling us. He's saying, don't settle for the simple answer. Instead, become a student of God in this scenario. He goes on in verse 6, and again, you may have memorized this as a kid if you grew up around the church, but he says, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. That's really what we've just been talking about, right? In all your ways, whether you're comfortable or whether you're in hardship, don't just lean on your own knowledge, your own wisdom, but listen to God, acknowledge God. And as you do that, he will make your paths straight. Remember, Solomon is talking to his son as he is giving him this information. And part of what he's directing his son in is he's saying, if you want to be a leader in life. Now remember, Solomon is the son of King David. So David was the king, Solomon's the king. He knows his son is going to be king eventually. Right? And he's saying, if you want to be a good leader in life, it starts with this: acknowledge God in the way that you do things. Yeah, let me just kind of pull that into our context here. Maybe you don't think of yourself as a leader, but I would almost guarantee you that you are a leader in some case, in some scenario. Maybe it's in your family, and you want to lead your kids well. Maybe you want to lead your grandkids well. Maybe it's in your workplace, in your office, in whatever environment you work in, where you want to be a leader in terms of the way that, not necessarily be the CEO, but you want people to follow your lead in terms of following God, something like that. There's probably a scenario in your life where you are a leader in one case or another, right? And what Solomon is saying in these verses is he's saying, if you want to lead well, here's what you start with. Here's the statement that you start with, all right? Leaders start with this statement: I don't know the answer yet. That may seem contrary to everything you've heard about leadership. Because you think of leaders and you think, oh, the leaders are the ones who have all the answers. They're the ones who are driving us a certain direction. They have it in place, right? But Solomon says, here's what wisdom says. If you want to be a leader, start with this statement: I don't have the answer yet. In other words, I'm not going to default to what I've always done, but I'm going to seek the heart of God on this matter. That's where wisdom comes from. That's where great leadership comes from. Comes from people that say, I don't know yet, but I'm going to ask God, and I'm going to pour over his word, and I'm going to figure out what God would do in this scenario, what God wants me to do. That's where great leadership happens. Right? And so Solomon says that. He says, acknowledge God in all your ways. And as you do that, God will straighten your path. He will make your path straight. Finally, in verse 7, and we'll wrap up with this, but verse 7 he says this: do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. So do not be wise in your own eyes, meaning exactly everything we've just talked about. Don't lean on your own understanding, right? And then he uses that little phrase, the one that we talk about earlier: fear the Lord and shun evil. And so I think it's worth just talking through it quickly. What does it mean to fear the Lord? Since we've thrown this out there, what is that? Do you know what the fear of the Lord is? It's exactly what we just talked about. It's the reverence for God that says, God, you know what? I'm not going to lean on my own wisdom. I'm not going to do things my way just because that's the way I've always done it. It's the reverence for God that says, I want your input. Before I make a decision, before I step out in a certain direction, I want you to be the leader for me. That's what the fear of God is all about. And so Solomon says, don't settle for the simple answer. in the moment, in the heat of battle, in whatever scenario you're facing, stop and back up and say, God, I need you to direct me. Seek his face. Listen to him. Ask him. Seek, knock. Find out, what would God do? What would Jesus do in this scenario? That's where wisdom happens. That's where uncommon sense comes into play. So let me ask you this. We always try to make things practical where you can actually step into this stuff and start to use it, right? And so how do you identify areas of your life where this fits? How do you identify areas of your life where you say, you know what, I have my routine, I have the thing that I always do, I have areas of life where I'm leaning on my own understanding? How do you identify those areas and then say, instead of leaning on my own understanding, I'm going to learn from God. I'm going to move from being a leader to a learner. How do you do that? I think, honestly, it's pretty intuitive for most of us. Just think through your week. What are the points in your week that you do over and over and over again? And you just, this is what I always do because this is what I've always done. This is the way I handle this. Maybe if you want to think about it in terms of days, maybe think about your Monday. And Monday is the day where most of us start off the day with kind of this sense of, if I could just have one more day on the weekend, then life would be good, right? Then everything would be right with the world. And we kind of walk into Monday with this sense of, I really don't want to do this. It's Monday. It's going to be a long week. And a lot of times that's just our routine. That's just the way that we start the week. What if instead of leaning on our own understanding in that scenario, what if we went to God and said, God, how do you step into something that you're not excited about? God, how do you walk into a scenario where you're not thrilled to be here? And maybe we follow his lead versus doing what we've always done. Maybe we go with God as a learner rather than just leaning on our old way of doing things. You have these moments that come up every day. And maybe you just think through your Tuesday and your Wednesday. Here's the way I've always done this, and this is what I just naturally default to, and think through, well, how does God want me to do that? Let me just give you a real world scenario, okay? Something that happened in my world this past week. It was one of these cases. So last week, JD and I, my wife and I, got a call from middle school. We have two daughters at the middle school here in Wellington, and we get a call from the middle school saying, hey, there is a bullying kind of case that's going on here, and one of your daughters is being picked on by this group of kids, and you probably should come up here. So we get that phone call, right? In that moment, if you're a parent, what's your default? I don't know about you, my default was kind of the thought of, I don't remember ever getting a middle schooler a black eye before, but I might actually, go there today. My default is, that's my child. I'm going to protect my child, that kind of thing. If you want to know what a bully is, I'm a little bigger than you. I'm about to show you what a bully is. That's the default, right? That's my natural, that's the way I've always thought, right? What if in that scenario, though, we just back up and say, God, your children get picked on all the time. What do you do? How do you step into that situation? What if we start looking through Scripture and saying, Jesus, is there a story of where you had something similar to this? What if we just go and say, God, I don't know the answer right now. I know what I want the answer to be, but I don't know the right answer. Will you just speak to me and give me what I need in this moment? Will you show me the details of how to step through this and walk this out in a way that you would do it? What difference would that make? What difference would it make in life if we just took time to say, I'm going to pause and back up, and rather than leaning on the same stuff the way that I've always done it, I'm going to learn from God. I'm going to listen to him. I'm going to be a student of his, and I'm going to learn what he would do in this scenario. Solomon says, first of all, that's uncommon sense. That's going to take your life to a place that is so much better than it would go if you just leaned on your own understanding. And second of all, did you see what happened? Second of all, the other thing that happens is you walk in this direction and all of a sudden you start to see, well, I know what my default is. I know that's my voice. But here's what God does. And here's what I hear him saying as I pray through things. That's his voice. And just see this distinguishing line between, okay, this is not just me rationalizing things. This is God leading me. I think Solomon said that's wisdom. That's what God wants for you. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Let's ask him to help us with this. Father, we need your wisdom. We just freely admit that we don't know what you know. We don't think the way you think. We don't react the way that you react. We freely admit that your ways are higher than ours. Your thoughts are greater than ours. And so I pray that you would help us to step into your wisdom. I pray that you would allow us to just, in the heat of the moment, pause and listen to you, seek you, become a student of yours. We don't just naturally do this well on our own, God. So we need your help here. But even today, as we head out and go to lunch, even today as we make decisions on the way that we communicate with people, even today, will you speak to us in a clear way? Will you give us direction? Will you just help us to stop and listen to you, seek your face, rather than diving into what we've always done? We freely acknowledge your way is the right way, God. You are the Lord. You are God, and we are not. Help us to walk with you in this way. We love you so much, Jesus, and we pray these things in the power